I'm going to talk to you about the effects of reduced sodium, added potassium salt substitute on stroke. And these are the results of a large trial that we reported in the New England Journal a couple of months ago for the salt substitute and stroke study. So the background to the study, you'll all be familiar with from the prior presentation. So high levels of sodium, as you've heard, are associated with higher blood pressure levels, and actually lower levels of potassium consumption are also associated with higher blood pressure levels. For a long time, there have been a large number of trials that show clear blood pressure lowering effects if you reduce dietary sodium or you supplement dietary potassium. Salt substitutes are novel intervention which combine these two effects with clear benefits for blood pressure lowering in randomized trials. So you basically, instead of having 100% sodium chloride, you replace some of the sodium chloride and salt with potassium chloride. However, before we did this study, the effects of salt substitutes on cardiovascular events were unproven. Salt substitution carries an at least theoretical risk of high blood potassium levels because you are supplementing potassium in the diet. And there had been concerns raised more generally about reducing dietary sodium intake, although those concerns were mostly based on rather weak epidemiology. But the consequence of all this uncertainty was that salt substitutes are very much a niche product and not widely used. So just to dive straight into the study, the primary aim was to define the effects of the salt substitute compared to regular salt on stroke. And we also specified two other efficacy outcomes. Major adverse cardiovascular events, which is the typical outcome that you see in large-scale cardiovascular trials of drug therapy. So it's a combination of vascular death or heart attack or stroke. And then the other secondary outcome that we pre-specified was total mortality, because that's the really hard endpoint that you want to try and change. We also, because of this potential effect on hyperkalemia, specified hyperkalemia as a safety outcome. For all the primary, secondary, and the safety outcomes we pre-specified, we got an adjudication committee of clinical experts to look at the evidence for each potential event we identified and adjudicate whether it was definitely or probably an event. And only events that were assigned as definite or probable were included in the main analyses. So we did the study in 600 villages and included about 35 participants from each village. And we did the study in rural China. We didn't do the study in rural China because we thought it would only work in rural China. We did the study in rural China because it was an easy place for us to do the study with existing collaborators and have a good chance of replacing a substantial amount of the dietary salt with the salt substitute. The people we put into the study were people who were at high risk of having a stroke, because when you do a trial like this, you need to record the events of interest to actually answer the question. So we took people who were more likely to have a stroke, and they were people who had a prior stroke or people who were older with poorly controlled blood pressure. People were also required not to self-report a history of serious kidney disease or use of other potassium supplementing drugs. And that was because we didn't want to put people at risk of hyperkalemia. But we didn't actually do any blood testing or kidney function testing to check their potassium levels, because we didn't want this to be a clinical intervention when we had the main result. We wanted it to be an intervention that could be viewed as a population health type intervention. So the study was a very pragmatic, large-scale trial. So we randomized 21,000 people. The study was open, so that means that we just gave the people in the intervention group salt substitute. We didn't try and blind it by also giving the people in the control group sort of masked regular salt. And we cluster randomized the trial. And that means that instead of randomizing the 21,000 people to salt substitute or regular salt, we randomized each of the 600 villages. So 300 villages continued to use regular salt, and 300 we provided with a free supply of salt substitute. And we did that again for pragmatic reasons, because it was much easier to deliver and get good adherence to the salt substitute intervention by delivering at a village level rather than an individual level. The challenge with cluster randomized trials is that you don't get as good statistical power, although if you have a large number of clusters and a large number of people, and we had both 600 clusters and 21,000 people, you actually still get pretty good statistical power. The salt substitute that we tested was a 75% sodium chloride, 25% potassium chloride mix. So it was still 3/4 regular salt, with just 1/4 of the regular salt by mass replaced with potassium chloride. And we compared against regular salt, which, as you know, is 100% sodium chloride. So the way we did the study is we recruited the 600 villages and the 21,000 people, collected their baseline data, and then once we got all the data, we randomized the villages to either the intervention or the control. All of the participants were followed every 6 months, and we did that with face-to-face visits for years, baseline, year 1, year 2, and the final year 5 visit. And in between, we used routinely collected health data about major health events captured through a rural health insurance scheme that covered well over 99% of the participants in the study. We also did some annual in-person measurements of blood pressure and urinary electrolytes in a subset of between about 50 and 150 villages and a couple of thousand of people to check that we were hitting key performance metrics in regard to statistical power. So what did that mean? Well, we set the study up to have 90% power with p equals 0.05 to detect a 13% lower risk of stroke with the salt substitute compared to the regular salt. And the key assumption we had was that the salt substitute group would have, on average, a systolic blood pressure that was 3 millimeters lower than the group that continued to use the regular salt. And we'd done a fairly large pilot study about a decade ago, which gave us a pretty good sense that this would be a reasonable assumption. We also had key assumptions around the numbers of people that were going to have strokes in the follow-up period. And as I've said, the numbers of villages, and also there was a factor called the intra-cluster correlation coefficient, which is important for cluster randomized trials. The analysis was done using Poisson regression, which is pretty standard for cluster randomized trials. We adjusted for multiple testing to make sure that we had a really robust result. We use pretty standard methods, Kaplan-Meier methods, to generate event curves. So what were the people that we put into the study? Well, they were on average 65 years old, so they were older. They were 50% women. About 3/4 of them had a history of prior stroke, and about 60% of them had poorly controlled blood pressure when they came into the study. More than 90% actually had a history of hypertension. About 1/4 were using an ACE inhibitor or an angiotensin receptor blocker for blood pressure lowering, about 43% a calcium antagonist, and about 80% some form of blood pressure lowering. Mean blood pressure, as you would expect, was high, about 155 over 90 millimeters of mercury. And on average, they were consuming about 4.4 grams of sodium, which is about 10 3/4 grams of salt, so just above the global average intake of salt. And they were consuming about 36 millimoles of potassium, in fact, perhaps slightly more than that, because not all potassium is excreted in the urine, which is nonetheless low by global recommended standards. So on average, we followed these 21,000 people up for 4.7 years. We saw a difference between mean blood pressure in the intervention compared to the control group of 3.3 millimeters. So that was about what we expected and lined up very nicely with our power assumption. We were able to get complete follow-up on everyone, which is pretty amazing, but is a function of the tremendous collaborators we had in China and our ability to access data through routinely collected linked health records. We also had very complete follow-up for non-fatal outcomes for the same reason. Another striking observation was that at the end of the 5-year follow-up, 92% of the participants who were still alive were still using the salt substitute, which is a really high proportion of adherence. There were about 6% of the control group which had started using the salt substitute instead of just continuing usual salt, and that would have slightly attenuated the effect that we observed. So what did we see? Well, this is the Kaplan-Meier plot for the main results. Overall, we recorded about 3,000 strokes during the study in about 2,500 people. And there was a 14% risk reduction for stroke and a very significant p-value of 0.006. So no doubt about it, salt substitute use reduces the risk of having a stroke. What about our secondary outcomes? So major adverse cardiovascular events. Well, there were almost 5,000 of these vascular deaths, strokes, or heart attacks recorded during the study in about 4,500 people. And you can see here that there was a 13% reduction in the risk of having a major adverse cardiovascular event. And once again, a very clear result with a p-value of less than 0.001. So salt substitutes clearly protect against total major cardiovascular events. And for the other secondary outcome, total mortality, there were 4,000 people who died during the study. There was a 12% reduction in the risk of premature death. And once again, really no uncertainty about that with a p-value of 0.001. So if you switch to a salt substitute instead of regular salt, you are reducing the risk of premature mortality. In terms of safety, you can see here the data for hyperkalemia. The first thing you can see is that the rates of hyperkalemia were low compared to the rates of cardiovascular events. There were only about 330 events in about 315 people. The rate ratio was 1.04 and the p-value was 0.76. So no evidence of any increased risk of hyperkalemia. I won't dwell on this slide, but what it shows you is the effects on stroke of salt substitute compared to regular salt in older, younger men, women, more or less educated, whole raft of different types of patients. And you can see here that the results were strikingly similar for all of the different patient subgroups that we included. So the study had some significant strengths. It was large, it was long-term, and it studied definitive outcomes. It had a very pragmatic approach to putting people in, which is potentially easily generalizable at a population level. The intervention salt substitute is very easy to make. It's available in most countries, just not made at scale. It is about 1.5 times more expensive than regular salt, but it is nonetheless a very low-cost commodity. However, in terms of weaknesses, we did the study just in China in a population selected to be amenable to salt substitution because we wanted to test the hypothesis. Record linkage was likely imperfect, but it was probably imperfect in the same way in both groups, so shouldn't have biased the result. We clearly didn't replace all the dietary sodium in the diet, so that means we've probably underestimated the true potential impact if we were able to switch the entire salt supply to a salt substitute supply. The hyperkalemia findings were for clinical hyperkalemia. We didn't measure potassium levels in anyone, but arguably it's the clinical hyperkalemia events that matter. We didn't have the money to assay kidney function in all the participants, which is a shame because probably we might have seen a benefit there. So just to give you a sense of what this might mean, in China, where we did the study, there's about 10 million major cardiovascular events occur each year, about 400,000 cardiovascular deaths, 400,000 strokes, and 150,000 non-fatal heart attacks. Or sorry, about 4 million, 4 million, and 1.5 million. In terms of the potential events that could be averted if salt substitution of the form we achieved in this study was implemented nationwide, you would end up averting almost 1 million major cardiovascular events each year, or about 10% of all the cardiovascular events that occur in China. However, we don't think the result is only applicable to Chinese people. The physiology that manages sodium, potassium, blood pressure, cardiovascular risk is highly constant across diverse populations, and we think the result is probably relevant to everyone that eats salt. It's most relevant to the 5 billion plus people who consume most of their dietary sodium as the discretionary salt that Kathy mentioned. That's salt added at the home, at the time of cooking, or for seasoning. And you can see those countries outlined in black in the figure. What do we want to see following these results? Well, we'd like to see salt manufacturers and retailers worldwide switching to producing and marketing salt substitute at scale, and ultimately replacing the salt supply globally with a salt substitute supply. We'd like to see the food industry worldwide rapidly start making products with salt substitute rather than with regular salt. There was a question in the chat box about price. We would like to see governments worldwide design policies that promote salt substitute and discourage regular salt use. And I think one of the very obvious opportunities here is to subsidize the price of salt substitute to the same price as salt. And of course, we'd like to see consumers cook, season, and preserve foods with salt substitute, not regular salt. Final slide. What about salt reduction and salt iodization? I think this study highlights a possible new way forward. As Kathy highlighted, salt intake is associated with higher blood pressure and millions of premature deaths each year. There has been this slightly uncomfortable sort of message that iodization of salt sort of makes salt appear healthy. I know that's not the intent, and I know we have got great strategies in place to do both salt reduction and salt iodization, but perhaps we could start to think now about an opportunity to truly resolve this contradiction by switching to the iodization and promotion of salt substitute, not salt, nationwide. So I just finish by acknowledging the huge number of collaborators on the study, and once again thank everyone for joining this call and taking the time to listen.